Welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Assessing Nature-Related Issues in the Infrastructure Projects in line with the TNFD's LEAP approach. This is the second webinar in a series of two, where we dive into TNFD early practices. Last week we did it in the agri-food sector with Tesco and Reckitt, and this week we have the pleasure to turn to an equally important sector or material sector to the health of ecosystems, namely infrastructure. We will spend the next hour together, and I have the pleasure to navigate us through this session. So my name is Marianne. I'm the Director of Nature-Related Finance at Global Canopy, and I'm also seconded into the TNFD Secretariat, where I work on sector-specific guidance, both on the metric side, how do you apply, what do you disclose on for specific sectors, but also how do you actually apply the LEAP approach, which we will hear much more about today in different sectors. But today, over the next hour, it is really the speakers that we have the pleasure to have with us today that are out there shaping practices, and yourself, who will really decide on what's the content of our conversation through your questions and engagement in this session over the next hour. We are running this webinar series because we are now shifting the focus of the TNFD from design of the framework to implementation and adoption. The framework was launched in September at the New York Stock Exchange with its 14 disclosure recommendations. And a few weeks ago in Davos, 320 market participants, both financial service institutions, but also real economy corporates, committed to adopting the TNFD as part of their 2024 and or 2025 financial year reporting. So now from today, or from that date, we really step into much more practice design. And that is what we will hear more about today. And today, I really have the pleasure to introduce the two speakers of the session. We first have Ash Welch. He is the biodiversity lead at AECOM Singapore, and he specializes in biodiversity impact assessments, nature-based solution design, and ESG nature advisory. In addition to undertaking biodiversity assessments and NBS design across 2 continents, Ash has also been pivotal in AECOM's nature advisory work and in AECOM becoming an early adopter, one of the 320 early adopters of the TNFD. In addition, we have Francisco Amorim, who's been working hand in hand in partnership with creating the results that we're going to see today. He's from Nature-based Insights, and he's a trained conservation biologist that transitioned from his extensive fieldwork experience to become a senior researcher at NBI, so Nature-based Insetting. Leveraging his background in ecology, he specializes in employing geospatial and statistical analysis on large data sets. And Francisco is dedicated to assisting the private sector in achieving ambitious yet feasible goals for nature biodiversity conservation and promoting positive impacts on the environment. And in addition to these two speakers, we also have the team behind NBI with us today. We have Gus, Jill, and Cecile from Nature-based Insights, and they will also help to address some of the questions in the Q&A. So if you see other names coming in to answer questions, that's the team that are helping us out on that. Next slide, please. So what you see on this slide is the agenda for today. So we are already unpacking point number 1, which is the introduction, which is super short. Then we will leave it to AECOM to understand and unpack for us how have AECOM created the business case to really dive into nature and TNFD adoption. Then we will look at applying the LEAP approach, more technical, that will be NBI in this infrastructure sector, the 4 phases. Then because of environmental impact assessment requirements for the sector, we will then dive into unpacking how these two can work hand in hand, that will be AECOM. And then we will look to the future in terms of what are the next steps and lessons learned. And we will make sure that we have 15 minutes at the end to really go into dialogue. Next slide, please. So this is the background of all of it. The reason for all of it is the TNFD. This is what you see on the slide is the architecture. And on top of the triangle is the TNFD, the core of it, which are the 14 disclosure recommendations. And all the elements you see underneath are the specific guidance. So these are not the mandatory elements, but those that you can leverage as a report preparer to help you gather the information to enable you to disclose across the 4 pillars with the 14 disclosure recommendations. We will dive into the upper part of it, which is the how-to guidance of the TNFD, the so-called LEAP approach, because that will enable companies and FIs to really understand what are the informations they need per disclosure recommendation. So, next slide, please. And just the last slide on to set the context. So Global Canopy, we are one of the founding partners of the TNFD. We are also one of 4 piloting partners. Since the TNFD was developed in an open innovation process, we did not want to create a framework for the market, but with the market. So to be science-based, but practice-informed. So that's why throughout the whole process, we've had piloting of the recommendations and also of the LEAP approach. That also means that when we launched the framework, we already had some practices to come out with and share. And those are some of the practices you will hear from today. So today we have Nature-based Insights who've worked with AECOM on a pilot as part of the TNFD, a part of the Global Canopy piloting program. And now with the next slide, I have the pleasure to hand it over to Ash Welch of AECOM to talk to us and unpack the business case. Over to you, Ash.
Thank you, Marianne. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to kickstart by talking about the business case today. So firstly, for those who don't know who AECOM are, AECOM is a global infrastructure firm that specializes in everything from design, consultancy, engineering, and planning. So just to set the context, the actual pilot that we've initiated is not of a TNFD assessment for AECOM as an organization or as a business, but actually how TNFD can potentially relate to infrastructure development projects. So as AECOM is involved in that business, that's what we're going to be looking at today. Next slide. So to kickstart, when we initiated this pilot, the first thing that we needed to do was to work out what the business case was. And if you look at the TNFD Getting Started guidance, it actually outlines what you should, or it recommends what you should do when considering your business case for nature. So this outlines 4 key points. It suggests that you take into account the economic and financial value of nature, risk management and mitigation needs, commercial opportunities driven by innovation and increased resilience, and the long-term viability of business models. So if you're working on an organizational assessment for utilizing TNFD, much of this will make a lot of sense, especially for those who've started to dig into TNFD already. However, when we're trying to apply it for an infrastructure project, it's not quite as intuitive of how you go about this. So one of the things from this pilot that we wanted to do was to understand how we do exactly that. And then following on from that, work out what the top-down influences are from the investor stage of development projects all the way down to the bottom end, which is where the design and engineering side of things work, the planning side of things, and then all the way into the construction and development. And then working out whether the infrastructure development itself provides risks and opportunities. So not looking at an organizational level, but looking at the infrastructure itself. And then finally, looking at the long-term viability of infrastructure and how that could be potentially considered through this pilot and utilizing TNFD more generally. Next slide. So first of all, I'd just like to provide a bit of context around AECOM and the types of clients that we have. So just to let you know, as part of this pilot, we decided to focus on infrastructure projects that were solely within Asia and within AECOM's business, Asian business line. And so just for a bit of context, there are 3 examples here of different clients we have in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So one is a project that we worked on in China with the Guangdong Olympic Stadium. So that's a design and build type project. We then have a Formosa oil and gas station soil and groundwater remediation project, which is in Taiwan. So that's a remediation project that requires a lot of environmental consulting, surveying, and so on. And then the final one I've listed on there in Singapore, which is where I'm based, is ABC Waters. So this is effectively the creation of a nature-based solution. So this just goes to show that our clients are very wide-reaching in terms, and the projects that we get involved in terms of infrastructure, are also very wide-reaching. And each of these is going to have its own set of impacts, risks, and dependencies. Next slide. So in terms of what we wanted to learn from this pilot, well, firstly, as I mentioned already, we kind of wanted to understand how the TNFD framework, and in particular the LEAP process, could be applied to infrastructure projects. We then wanted to also understand if it would conflict with the EIA process, so the environmental impact assessment process, and whether there's anything that TNFD could value add, if you like. We would also wanted to understand the types of data sets and metrics likely to be used. Obviously, TNFD recommends all sorts of different metrics to be used. How could these be applied in an infrastructure context? And finally, whether TNFD has the ability to help infrastructure development projects become nature positive. So this is obviously a big thing at the moment, and in places like the UK, where we have biodiversity net gain, that's driving towards this type of approach. But could the TNFD framework help us do this as well? Next slide. So on the point about EIA, one of the first things we sort of considered before we started the pilot was that the TNFD approach could potentially take the EIA in a direction that it hasn't really gone to before. Now, obviously, across the world, EIAs are applied to different extents. Some are very exhaustive, some are less so. And that really depends on local regulation and whether you're working to international standards and so on. But as a general perspective, there were three things that we kind of sort of outlined from the off and we wanted to discover. So first of all, could the TNFD process transform the EIA or development projects in general to assess the value chain in a bit more detail? Next slide, please. The next would be to consider holistic, wider reaching considerations. So as we know with TNFD, a lot of the recommended metrics and data sets to use are generally at a global level or a much more wider reaching level, whereas EIAs tend to be quite granular. So could this help us consider things in a more holistic manner? Next slide. And then finally, whether the physical and long-term risks to infrastructure and local populations could be considered. So at the moment, generally when an infrastructure project comes along, certain things are considered for long-term sustainability, but generally, when we're talking about nature, there isn't much consideration in the way of assessments that are being done, which can allow for the long-term risks and opportunities to be identified. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to pass over to Francisco now, who's going to go through the LEAP process, and then I'll be back again later to discuss some more specifics and a case study.
Thank you, Ash. Hello, everyone joining the webinar. So my name is Francisco Amorim. I'm from NBI. NBI is a company that is helping the private sector to navigate these frameworks, all these frameworks that are coming out, and also the regulations that are coming out. So today I'll share with you the technical details of this pilot, how we helped AECOM to take the TNFD a step further, and how this approach can help infrastructure sector to understand their projects interface with nature for disclosure under the TNFD. Next slide, please. So our contribution to this pilot was developed in two independent work streams. The first one is a high-level screening of nature-related values within project landscapes, which also includes a project ranking. And I would like to highlight that this can be extended to any company's assets. It's not specifically to the infrastructure sector. It's just a matter of the type of variables that you include and the risks that you include in the process that may change. But overall, the approach can be used in any sector. Now, the second work stream, it's more specific to the infrastructure project and delves into the analysis of the direct potential dependencies and the impacts of production process in the construction of infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Starting with the first work stream, the first step was about getting the geographical locations of the projects. And I would say this is the starting point for all the TNFD process and the LEAP process. Now, the level of detail that you provide in this step will influence the granularity and also the value of the following steps. And I would say this is a critical step where companies should actually invest some extra effort here to ensure they take the most of the process. So try to get as detailed as you can. But on the other hand, we also understand that having specific project locations can sometimes be challenging, and we understood this also in this pilot. Sometimes there are confidentiality issues, you can't disclose the exact location of the project. And what I'd like to highlight and take it as a take-home message is that even if you don't have like very specific locations, that shouldn't stop you from starting the process of disclosing your nature-related values. Next slide, please. So once we set the project landscape, we move to the core of our framework, which is directly linked to the LEAP, where we carry the comprehensive characterization of project interface with nature. And here we used over 15 different data sets and metrics representing multiple nature-related values, which were grouped into 8 categories, as you can see in the diagram. So, for instance, we have categories that are directly linked to nature or biodiversity, like biodiversity importance or ecological integrity. But we also have some other variables that will reflect physical risk, for instance, to the infrastructure sectors, such as landslide or cyclone risk or even flood risk. So there's a comprehensive approach here, very detailed, that we try to bring the most as we can. And of course, the important thing is that these categories are aligned with the LEAP and also the guidance provided by the TNFD. And just wanted to point out that you can see here there are 15 variables. We could have more here. I think this is a dynamic process. So the list of variables can actually evolve over time to answer specific needs and to improve the characterization. And it could change between sectors, of course. Next slide, please. And the final step of our framework focused on actually ranking the projects based on these 8 categories. And at the same time, we also link the ranking to key elements of impacts, risks, and dependencies and opportunities represented on the diagram by the color tabs. So you can see, for instance, biodiversity importance is highly linked to the impacts, while ecological integrity also reflects risk, dependencies, and opportunities, for instance. Next slide, please. Now, regarding how we set the area and the landscape, so the starting process, let me just share a bit of backstory. When we kick off this pilot with AECOM provided us a list of different projects across Asia, different regions of Asia. However, as I told you before, they could not disclose like precise locations for most of these projects. So we had to adapt, and instead of using specific project locations, which would allow for deep dives, we used a high-level geographic approach that led to the screening process of over 154 projects across 64 provinces in the region that you can see here in the map highlighted in orange. Next slide, please. Now, let's take an example of a project within the AECOM portfolio. Let's just call it Project A. As you can see, this is a project represented here by the orange lines on the map. And you can see that it includes multiple provinces of India. And of course, this clearly highlights the relevance of specifying the locations as best as you can to avoid covering excessively large areas, as in this case study. Of course, the project can cross multiple provinces, but it won't affect all the areas of those provinces. But I mean, the key message is that even if you can have specific locations, you can still consider this broader geographical context for nature-related values in what would be a conservative approach, if you want. Now, something that you need to be really aware when using this broad scale approach is that if you want to have like make more localized inference or set actions on the ground, you actually need to do a deep dive on each of the specific projects. So this gives you like a broad context of the nature in the project, but it doesn't allow to go really specific when you want to go to the ground. Okay, so this was our approach to overcome the difficulty in having specific locations. And once we have the geographic locations, we then move to the next step of our framework. Next slide, please. And this is where we evaluate the actual interface with nature. I won't delve into the technical details. Let's just take the previous project as a practical example to showcase how we did this. So we consider 15 layers, as I said before, and we calculated multiple metrics. Here we just show a subset of those metrics, respectively ecosystem extent and tree cover loss. Of course, I don't expect you to read what's on the text here. It's just to show you that we actually use spatial explicit information. We turn it into tangible insights and metrics to understand how the projects interface with nature. And I mean, this is project A that we took as an example, but this was extended to all the 154 projects. So this was done for all the projects. And I mean, in so many variables, you might expect that some of them will be more straightforward to include, of course, than others. But overall, this analysis ensures a robust understanding of the nature-related values in the project sphere. Next slide, please. Now, once we did this extensive characterization of the nature values, we arrive at the final stage of our framework. And here our focus shifts to evaluate the sensitivity of each project location in regard to the multiple nature-related values identified before. This might look complex, but this is just a simple ranking of the raw values of each variable that were categorized into the top, middle, or bottom third, represented in the table by 3, 2, and 1, respectively. Next slide, please. And just to briefly explain you the process, if we take critical natural habitat variable as a practical example, you can see that project A has the highest proportion of critical natural habitat, so it gets a ranking of 3, while project 2 with the lowest proportion will get a rank of 1. Next slide, please. Now, once we have each of the constituent variables for each category categorized as before, we can then have a total score for each of these categories. Here we just have biodiversity importance and ecological integrity, but remember from the beginning that we have a total of 8 categories, right? So once we have the total score for each category, we can move to the ranking of the projects. Next slide, please. So if we extend to all the 8 categories that we identify, we created a streamlined method for evaluating each project across the 8 categories, and we have the sensitivity for the project for each of these categories. And this allows us to have a comprehensive screening of each project, not only in terms of the 8 categories, but also, as I said before, because we link them to impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, we can also rank these key elements. Now, I would say that we made significant progress with this approach, but this was a pilot, and we are still developing and we have ongoing research to improve this method. But I think we got at least to an interesting starting point to understand our interface with nature in infrastructure projects here. Next slide, please. So I understand this might seem overly complex with so many data and so many metrics, of course, and it might seem like a daunting task to start, especially when you try to navigate all this data. But what I wanted to highlight actually is that companies can no longer use like the lack of data as an excuse for not disclosing how the business interact with nature. There's lots of data out there. There's lots of tools that can help you in this, at least starting this process. Next slide, please. And this is just like an overview of some of those tools that can help you. You have, like, for instance, the FAO ABC map or the WWF biodiversity risk filter. So, I mean, we use our own approach here and our own framework, which needs lots of technical expertise in terms of getting all the data together. But even if you don't have this expertise, you can still start with these projects for at least get like have a high level screening of your projects, how your projects interface with nature. Of course, it will always depend how granular you can get. And one of the tools that frequently comes out is the HiBot. Some of you might already know it and might have heard about it. And HiBot is a really interesting tool in this type of disclosing because it allows you to get information, basic information such as protected areas or key biodiversity areas or even information on threatened species. But it also has some derived data sets that are really interesting. So for instance, the STAR metric, which is a relevant component when looking at the opportunities to reduce species extinction risk, and it's also closely tied to the assess stage of the LEAP. But I would say that we also used IBOT. It was one of the tools. It was not the only tool, but it's an important tool, I would say. Next slide, please. Okay, so with so many data, you can expect some overlap, of course. But overall, the take-home message is, sorry, could you move to the next slide, please? Maybe I forget. Thank you. So as I was saying, so there's lots of information available, even though there are some overlap with some of these tools. You can of course start the process. And in the table on the right of the screen, you can see how some of these tools and data are directly linked to the TNFD metrics. And I mean, all these tools are really powerful, but I would say that you still need to be always aware of the limitations too. And at the end of the day, you always require some degree of validation. So if you do like this more desktop analysis, if you get into the prepare stage of the LEAP approach, and if you are setting targets and measuring progress, you always need to go on the ground and measure and validate your data. Next slide, please. Now, bear with me while I briefly present our second work stream. If you remember, we had like two work streams. One was the project screening and the ranking, as I showed you before. And then we thought that to provide a fuller picture of the nature-related risks and dependencies from within the project sphere of influence, it would also be helpful to understand the nature-related impacts and dependencies of the sector-specific materials and process used in the infrastructure sector. And this links to one of the comments from Ash in the beginning, that is like taking a step further in analyzing also the value chain of the infrastructure sector. Next slide, please. Now, the AECOM tool is a great starting point for this screening, the screening of materials, impacts, and dependencies. It's a free online tool. Maybe some of you have already heard of it, and it helps you explore the exposure to nature-related risk, and also to take the first steps to understand dependencies and impacts on nature. To use AECOM, we first categorize the different projects that we have in alignment with the global industry classification standard and production process, such as, so we classify them as highways and rail tracks, for instance, or infrastructure builds, as well as the key construction materials associated with them, for instance, steel and construction material, or wood or metal, and so on. So next slide, please. Thank you. So once we selected the relevant sub-industries and production process, we produced a heat map of the results of the materiality production process by impact driver, following the natural capital protocol, which some of you might know. I don't want you to focus really on this heat map. It's just for a sake of demonstration, but you can see that using this heat map, like water use as the highest number of very high materiality ratings as an impact driver, followed by ecosystem use, and after we have like greenhouse gas emissions and other gas emissions too. And this heat map actually helped us to determine which potential impacts might be of greater concern, and also allows us to understand which areas might be most relevant for further analysis. However, note that these ratings indicate only potential dependencies and impacts, and only inform an initial screening. So this should always be followed by spatial explicit and company-specific assessments before any decisions are made. Next slide, please. So once we have the heat map, we identify the key ecosystem service that might be most critical to the production process. And we produced a similar heat map of the dependencies per production process, and then performed a simple count of the number of very high, medium, and low scores for each ecosystem service dependencies. And this highlighted, for instance, climate regulation, followed by water maintenance and mass stabilization and erosion control as being the most material dependencies for the production process related to infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. We followed the similar approach for capital asset dependencies. And again, via a simple count of very high, medium, and low scores, the results indicates that water, followed by habitats and the atmosphere, were the most important natural capital assets of the production process, analyzed and linked, of course, to the infrastructure sector. Next slide, please. So here it's just a summary of the results in this work stream. I won't go through all of it, but you can read if you want. But I would say that the most interesting outcome is that of double materiality in the infrastructure sector. So where the production processes are highly dependent on the ecosystem service and natural capital assets, that they may be they are also impacting the most. So they impact water use and depend on water use, and the same for terrestrial ecosystem use, and also greenhouse gas emissions. And these results point to real opportunities for the infrastructure sector to integrate well-designed nature-based solutions in their project development. Next slide, please. And just to highlight, and this is my final slide, that as we speak, we are developing a second work stream, let's say, that closes the circle, and where we integrate the AECOM analysis that I just showed you with the spatial explicit project screening from work stream 1. And this way, we want to make the screening and the disclosure not only location specific, but also sector specific. So this will be the natural next step. And we hope to integrate all this information as soon as possible. And now I hand it over to Ash again, who will tell us about the complementarity of the TNFD and the environmental impact assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Francisco. So yeah, basically this next section is going to be a comparison really between the EIA process and TNFD. So this was something that we decided was potentially quite interesting, and so we wanted to take it a little bit further, this specific component, and understand what the current EIA process does and how the TNFD process could potentially advance it. So what I would say is, before we go on to the next slide, there is a case study involved in here, and this goes throughout the whole presentation. All of the different sort of projects that we looked at through this process, we're not critiquing the environmental assessments that were done for those projects. We're merely looking at how the data collected for them and the assessments done for them differ in comparison with what the TNFD framework suggests. So as we go on to the next slide, you'll see that I will introduce a case study. So this is Tengah, which is a new town development in Singapore. It's a really fancy biophilic development, and I'm sure once it's built, it will be heralded as another fantastic example of Singapore producing nature-based solutions integrated into the city. And this is a project that AECOM has worked on quite extensively, and we've done all sorts of different environmental assessments here. So this is one we did a bit of a deep dive into, because we had so much data that we could look at and compare with some of the assessment work that Francisco has just outlined to you. So as we move on to the next slide, I'll give you a bit of a rundown of the types of work that we did on this project and also the data we collected for it. So on the left-hand side, yeah, you can see that we've undertaken environmental baseline studies, environmental impact assessments. Collectively, these would include a whole range of things, including habitat vegetation mapping, botanical surveys, data for all sorts of animals and red list species, invasive species, although only those defined at a local level. We have data on forest regeneration and also ecological connectivity. Although I would note on ecological connectivity, it's purely qualitative. It's not been done in a quantitative means. And then in addition to that, we've got other environmental data sets around hydrology and water, soil quality, and so on. So we've got a really robust set of different environmental data for this project. And actually, in my experience, the data that is collected through EIAs in Singapore is actually very exhaustive, more so than my experience in the UK and other places. So I think this will give you an idea of how much further TNFD could take these assessments. In addition to that, we've been working on an environmental maintenance and management plan and done all sorts of engineering design work. So this really was a good one for us to focus on. Next slide, please. So this, don't focus too much on the table here in terms of the coloration, but basically this is taken from the initial screening process that we undertook for the different projects. And you can see we've got two of the Tenga-based projects listed on that table. And I just wanted to use this as a way to clarify that the EIA assessment really only deals with impacts at its core. And it doesn't look at things like the value chain. It's purely direct and indirect impacts associated with that project, really at a local level. If it's a wider reaching project, we might do it a little bit further with wider reaching in impact pathways, but it really only goes so far. And as you can see, as we go along that table, we've got risks, dependencies, opportunities. So the EIA process, and in particular this one that we're looking at, assesses things like opportunities in a qualitative sense. And that's where you get things like your mitigation measures that derive from your impacts. And they're generally recommendations for the project to take on. However, it's not doing the opportunity screening or analysis at that front end that the TNFD process sort of suggests that you do. And in addition to that, we're not really looking at dependencies, and we're not really looking at risks either associated with the double materiality stuff that Francisco just mentioned, or even the risks to the infrastructure long term. So some of these things might be done. You know, we might have sustainability teams working on scope 1 and 2 assessments, for example, for the project, but we're working in silos is basically the conclusion there. So next slide. So this is, so on the left-hand side here, I have a list of all of the different data sets that were collected for the Tenga projects. And then on the right-hand side, I've got a list of all of the things that TNFD might do differently and or didn't collect or would collect that the EIA process wouldn't do. So the ones I'm just going to focus on are the ones that are on the TNFD side. So for example, when we're looking at identification of protected species, at the local level, when we're doing the EIA, we're making it very specific to Singapore, whereas the TNF process might look at things a little bit further reaching, might look at the IUCN data from a global perspective, for example. And then in terms of invasive species, again, looking at a local level with the EIA process, but when we're looking at TNFD, Francisco showed some different data sets there, which use GRIIS, which are invasive species that are potentially considered at a global level as well. And we looked at very locally protected areas, whereas TNFD might point out things like biodiversity hotspots, global critical habitats, and so on. So what I would point out is that is if you're using the recommended data sets and metrics that TNFD sort of suggests. But actually, if you were doing the TNFD process, you probably would look a little bit more in detail, and you probably would collect data sets through the EIA process and then use them for TNFD purposes. So this isn't perfect, but hopefully introduces some of the concepts. So next slide. So these are just some examples of those sort of like global data sets that we looked at. So the critical habitat layer and the GRIIS, which looks at the invasive species. Next slide, please. And then going back to the table, it continues. You can see here is basically a list of all the things that TNFD looks at, which the EIA or baseline level assessments don't look at. So ecosystem condition or ecosystem integrity is one new concept that I really, really like. And I think in terms of resilience and long-term risk, this is a really good one to look at. Ecosystem change, again, is not one that's really looked at. And we do some desktop research in the EIA process, looking at how things used to look, now things have changed, but we're not really worrying too much about long-term ecosystem change. Physical risk is another one, so we don't really dig into that too much unless it's very specific to a project. Dependencies don't really look at water stress, reputational risk, the landscape scale pathways, and then obviously the value chain assessment we've already spoken about. So there's a huge amount of stuff that the TNFD process could take forward beyond the current EIA frameworks, which I think is really, really interesting. Next slide. And again, here's some more examples that we've already gone through. Next slide. And then finally, I just want to move on to lessons learned. So following that comparison, following all the stuff that Francisco did with all of the data analysis, and then moving forward, what did we actually learn from this pilot? Next slide. So first of all, I think as anyone who's digged into TNFD already would know that actually when you start to go into TNFD for the first time, it can be quite overwhelming. There is just so much to consider, and that's because nature is just so complex, especially when we compare it to climate and carbon. There is just so many variables that we need to consider, and every single project will be different. And further complicating that is that when you start to look at infrastructure opposed to organizations, a lot of people haven't even thought about that yet. So it can be quite overwhelming, but as Francisco said earlier, it's really important to just start. Even if you're not going to get it perfect, taking those baby steps can really help make positive changes. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned a moment ago, like there are all of the global data sets that we've assessed as part of this pilot, and which people will be routinely using in the future, I suspect. They do have limitations, and hopefully now that TNFD is driving a lot of these ideas and concepts forward, we'll start to see better data come forward. But just take them with a pinch of salt. But whilst I say that, it's actually very useful to use them, even if they're not perfect. They can give you insights to help you initiate this process. So also don't be confined by those global data sets. I mean, as I mentioned, if we were to apply TNFD onto infrastructure projects and not do it retrospectively like we have here, we probably would collect a different range of data than I showed you through my EIA example, for example. So actually, and a lot of that data then becomes very granular, very detailed, and then very useful. So you probably wouldn't in reality be constrained by the data sets, the global data sets, but I do think they would have importance in looking at things more holistically. And then as well, it's also useful to look at things in a different context. So as I mentioned, the TNFD process will be applied differently if it was done on an active project opposed to retrospectively. And then lastly, the TNFD process, I personally believe, having gone through this pilot process, needs to influence infrastructure development beyond the EIA. And I think it really does have the opportunity to do that. Next slide. So these are just a range of some of the key benefits that we've identified that TNFD could have in infrastructure projects. And it ranges from everything from helping to target true nature positive goals. So not just focusing on biodiversity, but looking at ecosystem services as well. And also looking at the value chain, of course. Looking at things at a more landscape scale. Combining TNFD and the EIA allows for a more holistic assessment. You consider ecosystem services. Most EIAs I've come across and worked on do not even think about ecosystem services in particularly. And also you can start to think about in terms of risk and opportunities in terms of the infrastructure, much in the same way as we would with businesses. And it could also be used for the businesses undertaking those development projects to disclose in their TNFD organizational commitments as well. So there's a whole range of benefits to doing it in infrastructure developments. Next slide. So what are the next steps for AECOM as an organization? So obviously we've committed to doing TNFD as an organization, but what I'm really interested in doing is trying to drive this discourse on applying TNFD in infrastructure projects. And hopefully this will be the catalyst. This webinar and the pilot will be the catalyst for doing that. And actually what I'm really interested in is trying to find opportunities to undertake pilots using this framework and this method on active infrastructure projects. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we can make that happen this year. And then in terms of what the infrastructure industry could do, well, firstly, it could establish a compliance team with members from different departments. It could assess current reporting practices and identify gaps. It could update procedures to align with the TNFD process and communicate changes to stakeholders. And it could also provide training for employees who were involved in the reporting process. I think one thing we've all identified is that there's a big upskilling task ahead of the industry, especially when it comes to nature positive and nature restoration. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Ash and Francisco. Now we turn to the questions, and we are fortunate to, well, thank you for making it less overwhelming, I think, with your very clear insights and practical steps, and also for showing us how TNFD is not a standalone, but it can be interoperable and even enhance the environmental impact assessment. I think that was super valuable and something new that came out when from some of the other webinars where we discussed other sectors. So we have a whole list of questions, and Gus have been really active trying to answer some of them, but I'll bring as many as we can over the next 12 minutes to you, and we will make sure to keep them and try to get them answered so that everybody feel they have a satisfactory answer over the next few weeks. So one you've already answered, I think, Ash, which is how much do you use EIA data in this? So I think that we can sort of leave to, you've already unpacked this quite a lot for us. Then there's a question which goes to both of you, which is on the project's ranking in NBI workflow. Can you share more about the opportunities? And then it just explains one of the challenges to scale nature-based solutions is how we can monetize them to apply sustainable finance. So I think this is for you, Francisco, in terms of the ranking in the NBI workflow. Can you share more on the opportunities?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I would say that opportunities was probably the most difficult to actually define, let's say, or characterize. Now, as I said, we are still working on this link between particularly in the risks and impacts and dependencies. Some of the links are not really clear, and it also depends on what we consider like an opportunity. So if we take the example, for instance, of the ecosystem condition in a specific area, if we have like an area with a high coastal flood risk or let's say high levels of landslides, so that will affect directly and will impact directly your project. So landslides can, for instance, affect roads or the infrastructures, or floods. Coastal floods can affect infrastructures in the coastal area. So this means that there's an opportunity there for investment in this type of like, let's say, minimizing these risks through nature, for instance, protecting the coastal lines, wetlands, making them more resilient to floods, or in the case of landslides, if you have like might have opportunities for restoring deforested areas or degraded lands, because they will protect the landslides. You know, they will stabilize the soil, they will avoid the erosion and all that. So this is a bit how we thought of opportunities. But I would say that sometimes the link of what is an opportunity, what is an impact, is not always clear. And I think it's really specific for each type of project. And I would say there's no one size fits all. So I think this is something that you need to know your project. You need to know the sector, the impacts, where it can be affecting your project or not. So it's and here it's also where.
Thank you, Ash. I think Francisco, I think we need to move to the next question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. So we have a question to you, Ash, from James Leah Cox, and it says, in your test case, how would TNFD have influenced the project design, etc., compared to an environmental impact assessment?
So I think I'll focus on the case study that I've provided. I mean, it would differ project to project, I think. Specifically in Singapore, on the project I showed you, there is a lot of work done on biodiversity, which I think is fantastic. And what tends to happen is lots of environmental parameters are assessed and you get data on those. So it could be any sort of environmental parameter, noise, air, pollution, water, whatever it might be. And those are assessed either against biodiversity or human aspects. But what it doesn't do, and a large part of the focus is biodiversity. We wouldn't look at things like carbon. We wouldn't look at other ecosystem services. It will purely be direct and indirect impacts to either biodiversity or to humans if there are people living nearby. So it wouldn't look at necessarily at like water quality for water quality's sake, for example, and how that downstream may have knock-on effects. And so I think the impact pathways only go so far, and that's because we're sort of limited by the scope that our clients present to us and the standards and so on. So I think it would go a lot further reaching. It would also influence, I think, different disciplines. So you might have sustainability consultant, engineers, environmentalists like myself, actually working a little bit more closely together, which I think we all want. So rather than working in silos, because a lot of the value chain stuff might actually be done. I mean, I've seen someone mention a question around physical risk. Engineers would consider that within their design, but we wouldn't really assess it as part of the EIA. So bridging all of those things together, I think, would be one of the key components as well.
Thank you so much, Ash. And the next question is for you, Francisco, which is turning to the conversation on data. It says, what are the sources of spatial data layers used for the analysis? Are they open access, and can you direct to some useful resources?
Well, yeah, well, we are a company, so all of them are so they are either in commercial free licensing, or for the case of IBAT, for instance, you need to pay the service to IBAT. So it really depends. It really depends on the type of data. I think I shared some of the data sources and the tools on one of the tables, and how they link with the TNFD metrics. I mean, there's lots of data nowadays. There's lots of platforms that are sharing data. I'd say that some of them are like the World Resource Institute, the WRI. It's one of the structures that we use the most. There are many data out there, and I mean, it really depends on the variables that you include. But yeah, I think the bottom message is the data is there. You just need to look for it and work it out.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then I think this one is for you, Ash, which is from Gunas. It says, what are the biggest challenges you encountered in your project execution in delivering your outputs to be credible and accountable?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of our outputs for this particular pilot, I mean, it really is a data comparison exercise. So I guess like in terms of credibility and accountability, it's ensuring that you're probably using some of the wider reaching global data sets that Francisco introduced. You're interpreting them in the right way, because I mean, Encore, for example, that we showed, I think when we went through the pilot process, there are various ways you can interpret that information, and you can go into all sorts of different directions with it. And yeah, you could have different outputs. So I think you really have to be careful with how you interpret things. And I think as the data improves, that will become easier. But actually, sometimes using a little bit of local expert knowledge and applying that in that context can be really helpful with some of that data. So it's not easy, but as we mentioned, yeah, it's always good to just start and initiate this process if possible. Excellent, thank you so much. And it goes into some of the same around the data track here. It's for you, Francisco. It's from Dr. Flavia. It says, thank you for a great and detailed presentation, Francisco. Which data did you use for tree cover loss? Any global products, or did you create that using your own methods and data? If you use global products, how did you discriminate the input error of mixing tree crop commodities with agroforestry system and natural forest? So lots of questions packed into one. I think the overall question is data on tree cover loss.
Yeah, lots of questions there, and very, very interesting and important questions. So let me just clarify that this was a very high-level screening that we did. So in this case, we didn't use customized data, though we do have a process for deep dives that we can customize the data and we can create our own data. In this case of broader scale approach, we used global data because they are more consistent across regions. So we used, for instance, the Young et al. For the ecosystems. We also used the Hansen et al. Information for tree cover loss. And as I said, you need to be aware of the limitations, and Flavia clearly pointed out one of the limitations for tree cover loss. It's not easy to discriminate. This was the first step of a broad scale approach. So we still think that the tree cover loss has valuable information. It helps us screening these projects. And the ones we want to deep dive in each of the projects that we prioritize, for instance, the ones with high priority, then we might move to a more customized solution where we have our own data on tree cover loss of forest to discriminate from agroforestry and so on. But in this high level, I think it's what's possible, at least or feasible for most of the companies, I would say.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we just have time for one more question, and then we need to go to the outro. And it's for you, Ash, and it's how should we justify, or how did you, I guess, justify the large increase in time and costs required internally to adopt the TNFD if the development outcomes and mitigation measures remain similar?
I think that's a really good point, because if we were to do everything that TNFD suggests that you do or recommends that you do, it likely would involve a lot more data collection. It would likely involve a lot more time. And so I don't know, we haven't got to that stage yet. We haven't worked that out. But what I would like to see is the TNFD approach and framework influence every aspect from the investor process all the way down to the design process. And I think if it's able to do that, and the investors are able to look at things at a high level and then distill that down to the next steps, you'll get a better idea of what to prioritize. And I think that's one of the things that TNFD suggests that you do anyway, right? Is prioritize what is important for your organization, or in this case, project. So I think if you followed that step, you wouldn't need to increase time, exponentially and cost exponentially. So I think it really is about focusing things and being a bit smart. There's so many new data sets coming available, remote sensing technology, where we can get things a lot cheaper and quicker. So hopefully being a bit smart about how we do things will really help.
Thank you so much, Francisco and Ash, for sharing this with us. And we try to answer some of the questions, but we haven't paid enough attention to all of them because we don't have enough time, but we will definitely try to get answers to you. Thank you so much for making the TNFD into more of a bite-sized format that we can know that we can learn from your practices, so we can get more to adopt and more to pilot and more learning across sectors and silos. So thank you so much. We just have a few more slides. So this was one use case or piloting use case. You can find a whole series of these on the Global Canopy website. So if you want to dive more into data layers, as we discussed, and some of the learnings of how to locate your interface with nature, etc., please go. It's completely open source and free. Next and last slide, please. And for the TNFD, we have the sector-specific guidance, which is LEAP guidance. How do you apply the LEAP for specific sectors? And also sector-specific metrics, so a specification of the global TNFD metrics and potentially additional for sectors. And they are all on the TNFD web portal, and it's part of an open hearing process until March 29th, where you can go in and create a profile and put in all of your feedback in terms of how do you think we should further change the metrics? How do you think where should we offer more information, etc., for the sector that you have an exposure to or that you're active in? So please go in and make your voice heard. We would really appreciate it. Then I just want to thank everybody for coming today. We will make this webinar and recording available. Thank you to the team, and thank you for Ash. Thank you to Ash and Francisco, and also thank you to the NBI team, Cecile, Jill, and Gus, for answering some of the questions in the chat. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day.